The last time I saw Lyla, she was walking out the door, her golden dress shimmering under the dim hallway light, her laughter echoing like a taunt. I thought I'd been betrayed by infidelity, but I was wrong. What began as a cheating wife vanishing at a party unraveled into something far darker, a spiral of lies, danger, and vengeance. When the truth came to light, it left me standing in flames, both literal and figurative. But before we dive deep into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy tales like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Stay tuned. It's gonna be intense. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a single bulb. The clock on the wall ticked with a maddening regularity, each second driving the silence deeper into Nick's chest. From the living room, Lyla's laughter rang out, a sound too bright, too carefree for the oppressive tension filling the air. Nick stood by the counter, his hands gripping its edge like a lifeline. His once sharp features were dulled by exhaustion and frustration, a man hollowed out by the weight of a failing marriage. Lyla, perched on the worn leather couch, radiated an effortless confidence. Her gold dress shimmered under the muted light, her detachment like armor shielding her from his gaze. Nick's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "You really think this is okay?" Lyla barely glanced up from her phone, her fingers still scrolling. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means this," Nick said, gesturing toward her dress, his tone low and trembling with restrained anger. "Whatever you and Greg are doing, it's not okay." Lyla finally looked at him, her lips curling into a smirk that held no warmth. "Oh, Nick," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Don't act so innocent. We've been broken for years. I'm just the one brave enough to admit it." "Brave?" Nick's voice rose, his fists clenching at his sides. "You call sneaking around behind my back brave? Leaving like a thief in the night?" "It's just a party, Nick. No strings, no commitments. Something you wouldn't understand." "Don't bother coming back," Nick spat, his voice shaking. "If you walk out that door, we're done." Lyla rose gracefully, grabbing her clutch. "Oh, Nick," she said with a cold grin. "Don't make this so dramatic. You'll thank me someday." The door closed behind her, and the sound echoed like a final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Lyla stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. The gold dress shimmered like molten fire, every fold and glint a cruel reminder of a better time, a time when Nick had given it to her on their anniversary, believing it symbolized their bond. Now, it felt like mockery. "Don't wait up," she said, her tone airy, almost dismissive. The door clicked shut, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed against Nick's chest. He stared at the empty space where she had stood. The glimmer of her dress burned into his memory like a scar he couldn't erase. 3 days later, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of Nick's phone. He answered on the third ring, his voice gruff and tired. "Mr. Reynolds?" The voice on the other end was calm but clipped, professional. "This is Detective Howard with the Fairfax County Police Department. Do you have a moment to discuss your wife?" "Ex-wife," Nick corrected automatically, his stomach tightening. "What's this about?" There was a pause, the kind that made Nick's blood run cold. "We believe your wife may be a victim of foul play. Her last known location was at a private residence in Rockford." Nick's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Foul play? What are you talking about? She went to a party with Greg." "We're aware of Mr. McAllister," Howard replied, his tone steady. "But it appears she never left the property. There's evidence to suggest she didn't leave on her own terms." The words hit Nick like a sledgehammer. He pressed his free hand against the counter, struggling to stay upright. "What do you mean? What kind of evidence?" Howard's voice softened, but the weight of his words remained. "Surveillance footage shows her entering the property. There's no record of her leaving. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions." Nick's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The gold dress, her laughter that night, Her dismissive tone. They all came flooding back, now laced with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. "I'll be there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The call ended, leaving Nick alone with a crushing mix of fear and guilt. The image of Lyla's gold dress haunted him, no longer a symbol of love, but a harbinger of something far darker. Nick sat in the stark, gray-walled interview room, his heart pounding as Detective Howard entered, a laptop under his arm. Without a word, Howard placed it on the table and clicked a file open. "This footage is from the night of October 14th, Howard said, his voice heavy. "This is the last time we can confirm Lyla was seen." Nick leaned forward, his breath hitching as the grainy black and white video began to play. The camera angle showed the grand entrance of a sprawling mansion. Marble floors gleamed under ornate chandeliers, and guests in lavish attire flowed through the space like a stream of wealth and decadence. And then, there she was, Lyla in her gold dress, stepping through the doors. Her movements were fluid, confident, almost defiant. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, before disappearing into the crowd. "Pause it," Nick said, his voice tight. Howard obliged. On the edge of the frame stood a shadowy figure, half concealed by a pillar. His posture was rigid, his face obscured. "Who's that?" Nick asked, pointing. "We don't know," Howard admitted, "but this individual never enters the main event areas. They remain on the periphery the entire night." "This activity said?" Nick's stomach churned. The video resumed, showing Lyla weaving through the crowd until she vanished into a side corridor. The clip ended abruptly. "She never came out of that corridor," Howard said. "No further footage of her exists." The room spun. Nick gripped the table to steady himself. "Who owns the mansion?" "Victor Kane," Howard replied grimly. "A man with powerful connections and a history of hosting, unconventional events." Nick's resolve hardened. Whatever had happened, Victor Kane was at the center of it. The moment Nick got home, he opened Lyla's laptop and logged into her social media accounts. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her posts, comments, and private messages. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Photos of brunches with friends, captions filled with curated joy. But then he found it. A post from 2 weeks earlier, a candid shot of Lyla in the gold dress, standing by a sleek black car. The caption read, "A night to remember." The comments painted a different picture. "Be careful with this crowd," one friend warned. "Victor's parties are intense. Hope you're ready." Nick's pulse quickened as he scrolled further, uncovering tagged photos of opulent gatherings. One stood out, a blurry snapshot of a chandelier, with a figure in the background holding a mask. The caption read, "Victor's world is like no other." Digging deeper, Nick discovered private messages exchanged between Lyla and a woman named Vanessa, someone he didn't recognize. Vanessa had sent cryptic warnings. "Victor doesn't take no for an answer. If you're going, you need to be careful. Don't be alone with him." The final message chilled him to the core. "Lyla, are you okay? You didn't text me after the party. Call me, please." Nick searched for Vanessa's profile but found it deactivated. Frustration clawed at him, but he kept digging, moving to forums and chat groups that referenced Victor Kane. Whispers of coercion, violence, and disappearances cropped up repeatedly, tying Kane's name to a dark underworld. Each new piece of information painted a clearer picture. Victor Kane wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a predator, and Lyla had walked straight into his den. Nick's determination burned brighter. He wasn't going to stop until he found her, or the truth. The mansion loomed ahead, a shadowed monolith against the night sky. Nick crouched behind a line of dense hedges, his breath misting in the cool air. The gate was heavily secured, but a small utility shed near the perimeter caught his attention. Using the tools he'd brought, he disabled the electrical lock on the shed and scaled the wall beyond it. The grounds were eerily silent, the kind of quiet that pressed on his ears. Cameras dotted the corners of the mansion, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Keeping to the shadows, Nick crept along the side of the building until he found a partially open window. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood. Marble floors stretched out before him, their polished surface reflecting the dim glow of an overhead chandelier. Nick moved cautiously, his steps muted by the thick rug beneath him. The deeper he went, the more sinister the surroundings became. A corridor led to a locked door, but through a crack he glimpsed rows of cages. Most were empty, but a few contained broken, lifeless objects. A shoe here, a scarf there, that hinted at the lives once confined. On the walls were screens showing grainy surveillance feeds of various rooms. Nick's stomach turned as he saw one feed labeled Basement 2, holding. There she was. Lyla, slumped against a wall, her golden dress torn and stained. Her face was bruised, her wrists bound by heavy chains. Nick's breath hitched, rage and desperation surging through him. Nearby, voices echoed. Two men stood in a nearby room, their conversation chilling. "He shouldn't have fought back," one said. "Victor's orders are clear," the other replied. "No loose ends. She's gone by morning." Nick clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his ears. He had to act now. Nick grabbed a fire extinguisher from the corridor, its cold metal a crude weapon in his hands. Bursting into the room where the men stood, he swung it with all his strength. The first man barely had time to react before it connected with his head, sending him crashing to the floor. The second man lunged, a knife flashing in his hand. Nick dodged, the blade grazing his arm, leaving a stinging line of pain. Adrenaline drowned out the sensation as he countered with a hard shove, pinning the man against the desk. A brutal struggle followed, culminating in Nick slamming the extinguisher down again. With the immediate danger neutralized, Nick grabbed a set of keys from one of the men and sprinted toward the basement. Each step down the narrow staircase felt heavier than the last, the faint hum of machinery growing louder. The basement was a cavernous, dimly lit space. Nick found Lyla chained to the wall, her head lolling weakly. "Lyla," he whispered urgently, his hands fumbling to unlock the cuffs. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Nick," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's me. I've got you," he said, his voice shaking. Just as he freed her, heavy footsteps echoed above. Victor Kane descended the stairs, flanked by two guards. His presence was chilling, his voice smooth and cold. "You must be Nick," Victor said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've caused quite the mess tonight." The guards moved first. Nick shoved Lyla behind him, brandishing the knife he'd taken. The fight was brutal. One guard swung a baton, cracking against Nick's ribs, but he retaliated, plunging the knife into the man's side. The other lunged, but Nick disarmed him, using the baton to deliver a final blow. Victor watched, calm and composed, as Nick stood panting. "Impressive," he said, "but this changes nothing." "Interfere with their duty?" Nick said, making a de facto statement. Nick didn't wait for his next move. He grabbed Lyla and bolted, the sound of Victor's cold laughter echoing behind them. She felt herself stirring, expecting him to move closer when she slept. Nick woke to a splitting headache, the faint scent of chemicals lingering in his nostrils. His body ached as he blinked against the harsh morning light streaming through the windshield of his car. He was parked in his driveway, but he had no memory of how he'd gotten there. His clothes were clean, no sign of the blood or bruises from the mansion. Panic set in as he fumbled with the door and stumbled out, his mind racing. On the ground near his doorstep, a sleek black envelope caught his eye. Tearing it open, his hands shook as he read the single line printed in crisp, serif font. "You can't save her again." Beneath it, Victor Kane's signature. A simple, golden K. Rage burned through Nick, but beneath it lay a deep, aching despair. Lyla was gone. He didn't need to search the house to confirm it. Victor had taken her back. The words in the note weren't just a taunt. They were a challenge. Victor was telling Nick he'd lost, daring him to try again. But instead of breaking him, the note solidified Nick's resolve. He clenched the paper, his jaw tightening as the grief morphed into a sharp-edged determination. If Victor thought he could silence him with fear, he was wrong. Nick vowed to dismantle Victor's empire, piece by piece, no matter the cost. Sitting in the wreckage of his living room, Nick stared at the note, its words searing into his mind. "You can't save her again." The sentence echoed like a cruel mantra, a reminder of his failure. A part of him wanted to give in, to collapse under the weight of his loss. Lyla's face haunted him, her bruised cheeks, the tear-filled apology she'd whispered before he'd freed her. He had held her hand, believing for one fleeting moment that they'd escaped. It was the complete opposite feeling of bracing himself. But now, all that remained was emptiness. Despair clawed at his chest, but anger kept it at bay. Victor hadn't just taken Lyla. He'd taken Nick's chance at redemption, at proving he could save her. Grief warred with rage until one emotion emerged victorious: resolve. Nick stood, his fists clenched. If Victor wanted a war, he'd get one. Nick wasn't just fighting for Lyla anymore. He was fighting to bring Victor Kane to his knees. Nick's plan started with precision and patience. Armed with names, connections, and documents scavenged from Lyla's social media and forums, he pieced together Victor's sprawling empire. Each thread of the network led to another: offshore accounts, shell companies, and powerful associates who thrived under the shadow of his influence. Nick began anonymously. Through encrypted emails and drop sites, he sent detailed dossiers to law enforcement agencies, financial regulators, and investigative journalists. Each file was damning: bank transactions tied to human trafficking, illicit property acquisitions, and coded communications that hinted at darker dealings. One by one, Victor's assets were frozen. His front companies, laundering money under the guise of legitimate businesses, faced audits and shutdowns. Trusted allies distanced themselves as investigations gained traction, leaving Victor increasingly isolated. The effects were immediate. News outlets began reporting scandals tied to Victor Kane's empire, casting a spotlight on his once untouchable image. But Nick wasn't done. He hacked into Victor's private accounts, using stolen credentials obtained from a corrupt accountant. Within days, millions of dollars disappeared from hidden vaults and offshore holdings. These funds didn't vanish into Nick's pocket. They were rerouted to victims' advocacy groups and organizations working to dismantle human trafficking. Nick didn't just want to hurt Victor's finances. He wanted to dismantle the foundation that kept Victor's empire standing. With every account frozen and every ally exposed, Victor's power began to crumble. Nick's final message to Victor started with meticulous planning. Using blueprints of the mansion he'd found online, Nick identified the weak points in the estate's security system. The backup generators, tucked away in a utility shed, became his primary target. Under the cover of night, Nick infiltrated the property. He carried a homemade EMP device, built from salvaged electronics and powered by a car battery. Each step was deliberate, his movements shadowed and silent. Reaching the shed, he activated the EMP. A low hum filled the air before the entire estate plunged into darkness. Security cameras blinked off, alarms silenced, and the grounds fell eerily still. Nick worked quickly, laying gasoline-soaked rags at key structural points around the mansion. The smell of fuel mixed with the crisp night air, a promise of destruction. The first spark ignited a small flame, but it grew rapidly, licking at the walls and engulfing the elegant facade. Within minutes, the mansion was ablaze, the roaring fire painting the sky with an orange glow. As Nick retreated to a safe distance, he watched the inferno consume Victor's fortress. Each crackling beam and collapsing wall felt like a victory, a symbol of Victor's empire crumbling to ash. Before leaving, Nick planted a note at the gate, scrawled with a single sentence: "You can't silence me." The message was clear: Victor's power was waning, and Nick's war was far from over. Nick stood on the porch of Lyla's childhood home, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The door opened, revealing Marjorie, Lyla's mother, her face twisted into a frown at the sight of him. "Nick," she said coldly, her hand gripping the edge of the door as if she might slam it shut. "We need to talk," Nick said, his voice sharp and unwavering. Marjorie hesitated but stepped aside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and tension. Thomas, Lyla's father, sat rigid in his chair, his eyes avoiding Nick's. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nick demanded, the words cutting through the silence. "You knew Victor Kane was dangerous. You knew Lyla was walking into something horrific, and you said nothing." Marjorie's lips pressed into a thin line. "We didn't know." "Don't lie to me," Nick roared, slamming his fist against the table. "You knew exactly who he was. You let her go." Thomas spoke, his voice trembling. "We were scared. Victor, he has people everywhere. Nick cut him off, his anger boiling over. "She's dead because of you, because you were too cowardly to warn her, to warn me." Before Marjorie could respond, Vanessa, Lyla's younger sister, emerged from the kitchen. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "Stop," she said softly. "I'll tell him." Nick turned to her, his anger momentarily tempered by curiosity. Vanessa swallowed hard, her voice quivering. "Lyla knew. She tried to leave. She told me she was going to run, but Victor, he doesn't let people go. She said she'd seen things, terrible things. She was scared, Nick. She thought she could handle it, but she couldn't." Nick's chest tightened as the weight of Vanessa's words sank in. Lyla had fought, had tried to escape, and they had all let her down. His fury burned hotter, now aimed at a family complicit in her fate. "She trusted you," he said through gritted teeth. "And you let her die," he said. The package was waiting for him on the doorstep, unmarked except for his name, written in neat block letters. Nick carried it inside, his chest tight with unease. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as though it carried something more than just its physical contents. Sitting at his desk, he tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a USB drive and a single note. "You need to see this." Nick plugged the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, and a grainy video began to play. The dimly lit room on the screen was immediately familiar. Victor's basement. Lyla appeared, her face pale and bruised, her golden dress torn. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears, and her voice shook as she spoke. "If you're watching this," she began, "then I didn't make it out." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "I thought I could fix this, Nick. I was wrong." Nick's eyes stayed locked on the screen, his breath shallow, his chest heaving with suppressed emotion. Lyla's words pierced through him like daggers. "Lyla, I'm sorry," she continued, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry for leaving you to deal with all of this. I thought I needed freedom, but all I found was hell. Victor, he's worse than I ever imagined. He breaks people, and when they're no longer useful..." She trailed off, her eyes filled with a haunting regret. Nick's hands gripped the edges of the laptop so tightly his knuckles turned white. A lump formed in his throat as Lyla whispered, "I love you. I always did. Please, Nick, make sure he pays for what he's done." As the video ended, Nick sat frozen, his chest burning with equal parts grief and rage. Her plea became his purpose. He swore then and there that he would track Victor down and end him. For her and for himself. The villa sat perched on a cliff, its sprawling grounds illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight. Nick crouched in the underbrush, surveying the guards patrolling the perimeter. Armed and vigilant, they moved in predictable patterns, an advantage Nick had spent weeks studying. Using the cover of darkness, he crept toward the rear entrance. The faint crash of waves below masked his footsteps as he cut through the wire fencing with a pair of bolt cutters. His breathing was steady, his movements deliberate. The service door he approached was secured with a keypad lock. Pulling out the stolen code he had procured from a bribed associate of Victor, he entered it with trembling fingers. The door clicked open. Inside, the villa was quiet. The polished floors and luxurious decor stood in sharp contrast to the grim purpose that had brought Nick there. He moved silently, his Glock drawn and a combat knife strapped to his side. Reaching the central corridor, he spotted 2 guards. A quick, efficient takedown left them unconscious on the floor. With each step closer to Victor's study, the weight of his purpose bore down on him. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about ending a monster. Victor was waiting for him. The study door swung open to reveal the man seated at a massive oak desk, a tumbler of whiskey in hand. He didn't flinch as Nick entered, his gun raised. "So, you've come all this way," Victor said, setting the glass down with a smirk. "Do you feel brave, Nick? Or just desperate?" "Stand up," Nick growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Victor rose slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Do you really think killing me will change anything?" Before Nick could reply, Victor lunged. The desk between them flipped, sending papers in the whiskey glass crashing to the floor. Nick fired, but Victor's movement threw off his aim, the shot ricocheting off the wall. The fight descended into chaos. Victor's strength was brutal, his punches landing with bone-crushing force. Nick countered with precision, landing a sharp blow to Victor's ribs before driving him back with a kick. The room became a blur of violence. Fists, knife strikes, and blood splattering against the walls. Victor managed to grab a broken chair leg, swinging it with deadly intent. It struck Nick's shoulder, sending him sprawling. But Nick wasn't done. Gritting his teeth, he lunged forward, slamming Victor into the desk. The knife in his hand found its mark, plunging into Victor's side. Victor gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "You think this changes anything?" Nick twisted the blade. "It ends with you." Nick set the charges quickly, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The villa's foundation was laced with explosives he'd brought in a duffel bag, strategically placed to bring the structure down. As he exited the villa, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. He stood on the cliff's edge, the detonator heavy in his hand. Behind him, Victor's lifeless body lay amidst the wreckage of the study. Nick pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the villa with deafening force, a fiery bloom lighting up the sky. Walls crumbled, glass shattered, and flames consumed everything Victor had built. Nick didn't flinch as the shockwave hit him. He watched in silence as the inferno raged, the villa collapsing into rubble and sliding down toward the cliffs. It was over. Victor's empire had burned to the ground, and for the first time in years, Nick felt the weight of his vengeance lift. But as he turned away from the smoldering ruins, he knew the scars Victor had left, on him, on Lyla, on countless others, would never truly fade. This was no victory. It was simply an ending. The flames of Victor's villa had long died down, but inside Nick a different fire burned, one of emptiness and regret. He sat in the silence of his apartment, staring at the crumpled note Lyla had left behind. The revenge he had spent months orchestrating felt hollow. Victor was gone, his empire reduced to ash, but the ache of Lyla's absence remained. Nick replayed her video in his mind, the haunting regret in her voice, the way she had whispered, "I'm sorry for leaving you to endure this." He had fulfilled her final wish, but the victory brought no peace. The world had moved on, but Nick was stuck, tethered to memories of what could have been. Even with Victor dead, the scars ran too deep. His hands trembled as he poured another glass of whiskey, each sip drowning him further in the knowledge that he had won the war but lost himself in the process. The fallout from Victor Kane's destruction rippled through everyone connected to him, and Lyla's family was no exception. Marjorie and Thomas, once pillars of their community, became pariahs. Their silence about Victor's danger and their complicity in Lyla's fate drew the ire of neighbors and former friends. The media uncovered Thomas's gambling debts and Marjorie's ties to a failed charity, painting them as selfish and negligent. Their home was vandalized, with spray-painted accusations of cowards and murderers scrawled across their walls. Vanessa fared no better. Though she had confessed to Lyla's attempts to escape, her decision to stay silent until Nick forced her hand made her complicit. Unable to bear the shame, she fled town, leaving her family behind to face the consequences. Nick heard about their downfall but felt no satisfaction. Their suffering couldn't bring Lyla back, and their guilt only deepened the tragedy. In the end, their silence had cost them everything, just as it had cost him the woman he loved. Nick sat alone in the dim light of his apartment, the laptop open before him. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the play button of Lyla's final video. This would be the last time he'd watch it. He owed her that much. As the video began, Lyla's trembling voice filled the silence. Her eyes, weary yet resolute, seemed to pierce through the screen. "Make sure he pays," she had said, her words a plea and a command. In the last video, she believed she could find his exiled nieces. Nick exhaled, the weight of her words settling over him one final time. He had fulfilled her wish, dismantled Victor's empire, and brought him to justice in the only way he knew how. Yet, the cost had been staggering, his soul fractured by the path he had taken. When the screen faded to black, Nick closed the laptop and whispered, "I did it, Lyla." For the first time, the burden in his chest lightened, if only slightly. But as he stared into the quiet of his empty home, he realized the truth that would haunt him forever. He had taken revenge, but the price was a broken soul.